The Odyssey has been one of the most influential stories told over the last 3 millennia, and it has had a strong influence on the way we tell stories. It has had a strong influence on culture, and of course, it has had a strong influence on our art. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. Because if you didn't know, I have just wrapped up my big coverage on this channel of the mythical eternal story of the Odyssey. It is a 7.5-hour passion project I began in June or July of last year, and on my birthday I finally released the video on the main channel. And so if you're interested in the story of the Odyssey, please check it out. I would absolutely appreciate it. But one element of that video that I don't address in the video is that of the artwork surrounding the Odyssey. Because being a 3,000-year-old story that has impacted culture as strongly as the works of Homer have, of course it has been the subject of many a painting, many a sculpture, particularly from the Renaissance period and onwards. And so today I kind of wanted to put the spotlight on the art itself and showcase not all of the paintings that I came across in my making of this video, but showcase some of my favorites and why I think they are such powerful pieces of art. Because you may not know this looking back on my channel, but I am a huge fan of classical artwork, particularly like, you know, the Renaissance period, the Baroque period. I should have mentioned this at the beginning, put this at the beginning, but spoilers for the Odyssey ahead. And if you want a summary of the Odyssey, please, please, please watch this video. I put so much time into it. It's an amazing video. It's a very long video, but I think it's worth it. And speaking of the Baroque period, we are going to be beginning this video with a portrait by the artist Rembrandt of Pallas Athena. This is, of course, a portrait done by the Baroque artist Rembrandt of the goddess Athena, and it is my absolute favorite piece of artwork in this whole collection. For those of you who don't know, I am a huge fan of... is fan the right word? I am a huge enjoyer of the works of Rembrandt. One of my favorite paintings of all time is The Return of the Prodigal Son, another piece by Rembrandt. If you don't know, my absolute favorite period of art in human history was the Baroque period for its heavy use of contrasting light and shadow, known as chiaroscuro, and a lot of the artists in that day would paint very realistic and very dramatic scenes. Artists like Rembrandt, Caravaggio, and so when I discovered this piece of art, I became obsessed instantly. Now, obviously, Rembrandt here is depicting the visage of the goddess Athena, and I just love how subtly but how well he includes many of the famous iconographies of the goddess in this work. As you can see, the plume of her helmet is adorned by a golden owl, a symbol of the goddess of wisdom. Owls, of course, being very heavily associated with the trait of wisdom. And the armor is just absolutely beautiful, magnificent and golden, adorned with red plumes and a red cape. It just goes insanely hard. I love this piece. And I love the very subtle detail of the Aegis, the great shield of Athena. Obviously, it is primarily shadowed in this rendition that you see. But even so, despite the fact that it is cloaked in darkness, you can see the coils of snakes writhing on the surface of the shield. The Aegis, of course, being another symbol associated with Athena and Zeus. It is a great shield that bears on its face the head of Medusa the Gorgon. Obviously, Medusa being an iconic character with hair made of snakes, turns people to stone. It was actually Athena that did it to her. But in this painting, it's just so subtle. And I love that the detail is included but not spotlighted because it would distract from the subject of the painting, of course, being Athena herself. I just think this is a really fantastic portrait. It's one I used very often for Athena in the video, and there are plenty of others we need to get to, so let's move on. And next we have this one by artist Arnold Böcklin. I'm not sure. There's the 2 dots above the O in his name, so that usually means it makes the sound. And I don't have the title of this painting in front of me. I'll put the titles of most of these paintings on the screen because I don't remember them off the top of my head. But this one, as you can see, depicts the goddess Calypso and Odysseus on the island of Ogygia. And I love this painting because it very perfectly demonstrates the situation that Odysseus finds himself in during his exile on Ogygia. I go over it in my actual video on the Odyssey, but Odysseus was trapped on the island of Ogygia for 7 years with the goddess nymph Calypso. And during that time, she fell in love with him, although he never reciprocated those affections. And of course, every day he looked out to sea, longing to return home to his wife and to his child. But every night, because she is a goddess who is capable of ignoring and overriding trivial mortal concepts like consent, she would charm him each night to lay with her against his will. And I think that entire situation is summed up perfectly in this painting by Böcklin. Because in this painting, your eyes are immediately drawn to the 2 primary figures in the painting. The first being Calypso, as she is the one facing the viewer of the painting, and she is presented in this piece as a figure of temptation for Odysseus, here sitting on a cloth made of this very bright red fabric, which immediately draws the eye. And yet, despite this immediate visual temptation, Odysseus is facing away from her and away from the viewers of the painting, and instead looking out towards the sea, which you can barely see in the left-hand side of the painting. And this is how he would spend most of his days on the island, looking out to sea, ignoring the goddess who is trying to seduce him on her island. I just like this one because I think it is a very poignant and very on-the-nose description or summary of the situation of Odysseus in his exile. All right, let's find another one, shall we? And then we have this piece of art. This is The Suitors by Gustave Moreau. Specifically, this painting depicts the slaughter of the suitors by Odysseus at the end of the story. And this painting has a little bit of a history behind it that I can only remember a little bit off the top of my head, but this painting was left incomplete by Gustave, who was never fully satisfied with the piece in and of itself. I think the main problem he had with it was that his subject, Odysseus, was very small in the background. I'll highlight him on screen for you. But a lot of focus is given in this photo to the grandiose architecture of the Hall of Odysseus, as well as the figure of Athena, bright and glowing in the center of the room. And in the background, you can see Odysseus with his bow at his hand, and a little owl flies above him, the symbol, of course, of Athena. But of course, the main thing your eye is drawn to is the chaos and the carnage of the suitors in this moment. And it's for that reason that I really like this work in particular. In terms of focus, it is very messy, and in my mind, I think that's a good thing because it highlights the chaos and the just the frantic nature of the suitors desperately trying to survive while being killed rapidly by Odysseus and his men, and of course a goddess. And while it is an incomplete painting, I did want to include it in my video because I think it perfectly demonstrates the absolute chaos that would have ensued in this moment. 108 suitors going up against 4 men, and of course 1 goddess. All right, let's move on. This is another one of my absolute favorites in terms of portrayals of the Odyssey. This is Penelope unraveling her web by lamplight by Joseph Wright of Derby. In the story, there is a deception played by Penelope while the suitors are besieging her home, where she is working at her loom to weave a burial shroud for Odysseus's father Laertes in the event that he passes. But she is using this as a stalling tactic to push back her decision, and so at night when all the suitors are sleeping, she would unravel the work she had just done at her loom so that she could stall her decision even longer. And so this painting depicts depicts Penelope unraveling her work from the day, and she is seated at the bedside of her son Telemachus, who in this painting is a mere child. So this would have been years before the events of the Odyssey, before Telemachus had become an adult. And I love the use of lighting in this particular painting, because the spotlight, of course, is on Penelope as she is unraveling her work, gazing at her son, fearful and saddened for the situation they find themselves in, while Telemachus sleeps peacefully, unable to do anything about it. And you can also see pictured at the side of Penelope a dog. This is presumably Argos, the dog that Odysseus had adopted before he set sail for Troy. It is the picture of a family that has been left alone, and that is made clear by the statue just to the right of Telemachus. A statue of Odysseus, the great warrior who has been long gone from their island. A father who was unable to raise his son, and a husband who was denied the luxury of growing old alongside his wife. And so Penelope stares forlornly at her sleeping son, and the statue of Odysseus watches over both of them like a silent guardian. I absolutely love the use of light and shadow in this painting to portray this very sad image of a couple that has been divided by years and distance. And there's going to be another painting brought up in this video that does a similar trick as well. But I absolutely love the composition of this shot. It really just highlights the despair and the hopelessness that they were feeling in their own house. And remember when I just said that there was going to be another in the set that did a similar trick? This is that one, by the way. This is the painting Penelope awakened by Eurycleia with the news of Ulysses' return. A lot of artistic depictions of the Odyssey refer to Odysseus as Ulysses. People who watched the video will know. And this particular painting is by Angelica Kaufman. I used several of her paintings in the video as well. She was one of the names who very frequently popped up while I was looking for artwork of the Odyssey. This depicts the moment just after the slaughtering of the suitors, in which the old maid Eurycleia runs up the stairs to awaken Penelope and tell her the good news that her husband has returned. And I love this absolutely tender moment between the two, both in the story and in this painting. This old maid who has served the house her entire life, and very tenderly puts her hand on Penelope's shoulder in order to wake her. A lot of reverence is given in the story to the maid Eurycleia, and honestly, I wish I could have used this painting a lot more in the video for sections where I mentioned Eurycleia, but I didn't want to spoil the ending by using this painting prematurely. But I absolutely love this tender scene, and of course the two subjects are illuminated by the lamp at the base of Penelope's bed, but in the background you can see a figure watching these events unfold. That is a statue of the goddess Athena, the goddess who was responsible for the return of Odysseus and the orchestrator of all of the events that led to his return and to his revenge. And so I love that this is a tender moment spotlighting the two women in this story, and yet there is in the background the presence of a third, the goddess who masterminded all of this. It's a really cool technique, and I love that two different painters decided to use a similar technique to tell a very cool story. Moving on. And then we have this one. This is a depiction of the fall of Troy by Daniel Van Hale. I hope I'm saying his name right. I dare not say it the other way. This is, of course, more of a reference to the Iliad than it is the Odyssey, although the fall of Troy is kind of the backdrop of the Odyssey. It is the inciting incident of sorts. And the main thing I wanted to point out in this one is just the sheer, chaos and almost apocalyptic nature that the artist gives to the fall of Troy. And yet, despite all the fire, all of the panic, all of the people fleeing that you can see all throughout the photo, in the center of it all, very serenely standing there by itself, is the image of the horse, the instrument of the demise of Troy. I absolutely love this composition for that reason, because while your eye is drawn to the inferno and the carnage around you, you do inevitably find yourself gazing at the eye of the storm, that is, the horse. It's a really cool piece for that, I think. Moving on. And as a bit of a more kind of disturbing entry in this list here, we have a portrait of Cassandra, the priestess of Athena, in Troy. Now, I do go into more depth, although not into excessive detail, on what happened to her in the story of the Odyssey in my coverage of the Odyssey. But needless to say, she was a priestess of Athena in the city of Troy, and her story is one of trauma and tragedy in this story, as she becomes one of the many victims of the Greeks' siege of Troy, and it is partly what happened to her in the story that led to the gods turning on the Greeks so fast after the war. And so knowing her backstory, I find this portrait kind of haunting. I almost didn't include it in the final edit of the video because I thought that it might be a bit too much just because of the implications and because of what happened to her in the story, but I did think it was important to include this photo and not just the nice smiling portraits of many of the other women in the Odyssey. And so she is depicted in this painting. I don't remember the artist's name, unfortunately. I'll probably have it on screen, but she is depicted in this scene very close up, and she is screaming in terror, not knowing what is about to happen to her, or maybe screaming because of what has already happened to her. This is one of the more haunting entries in the greater artwork of the Odyssey and kind of the characters who were involved in that. And there's going to be one more that I want to spotlight that is more on the terror side, but in a more cosmic sense and in a less personal sense than this one is, because this painting, especially when you know the story of Cassandra, is very confrontational. And I think it's supposed to be, and it does it really well. Moving on. This is another one that I really love from the collection that I used in the greater video. This is a painting of Ulysses, Odysseus, and the princess Nausicaa. And I love this one purely because it tells almost their entire story in just one image. Odysseus had landed on the island of Sicarea the day before and had slept the night very haggard, very worn out by drifting at sea, and so he had passed out in a gathering of bushes and trees. And it was Athena who had directed Nausicaa and her maids to go to the river to wash their clothes and to bathe, but ultimately that was just the pretense for getting her in contact with Odysseus. And so this piece depicts the exact moment in which they met. We see Odysseus emerging from the bushes, haggard, worn by his time at sea, fully nude, of course. A lot of times Renaissance era paintings like to just have people be nude for no reason, but in the actual story of the Odyssey, he was indeed fully nude because he had been adrift at sea for like a month almost and just battered by relentless storms and stuff. But before he had emerged, Nausicaa and her maids had been playing catch. They had been throwing a ball around. This is actually described in the story of the Odyssey. And you can see that very ball at the feet of Nausicaa. And so this almost creates a bit of a headcanon on part of the artist, John Weber. But this painting tells an entire story in one image. It is clear that in their game of catch, the ball strayed too far out of their reach towards the bushes, and when Nausicaa went to pick it up, Odysseus emerged, and in the background you can see the maids who, at the sight of this haggard and dangerous-looking man, fled in terror. It is only by the power of the goddess Athena that Nausicaa held her ground. And so I love this image purely because it tells an entire story in one image, and I just love an artist who can do that. Okay, moving on. This is one that I love purely because it is an incredible landscape photo, although there are human subjects you can see in the bottom frame here. This is an artistic depiction of Odysseus landing on the land of the Lotus Eaters. I say a couple times in the video covering the Odyssey that this was the island of the Lotus Eaters. That was a mistake on my part. The land of the Lotus Eaters is actually depicted as being a region of northern Africa that is now the country of Tunisia. But I love how the artist depicts this absolutely beautiful landscape of just very exotic plants, a very golden sun. It is a very peaceful looking image, which is very fitting because the Lotus Eaters live in perpetual bliss due to the nature of the lotus that they are consuming, this magic flower that deprives them of urgency and of, they're just high all the time, really. But there is activity going on in the foreground, of course, but I just love focusing on the just beautiful landscape. All right, moving on. And next we come to this artistic depiction of the magician, sorceress, witch, Circe. And specifically, this painting is actually an imagining of Lady Hamilton as Circe. Lady Hamilton is a figure who lived in the late 18th to early 19th century and became a renowned English model for many a painting. She was also an actress and a socialite, and was used as the subject of many a painting, including this one, where she is depicted as the Lady Circe of Aiaia. And this is a painting by George Romney, and there's also a credit to Emma Hart. But I love this portrait purely because it captures the duality of Circe that you see in the Odyssey, because she lures Odysseus's sailors in with very sweet talk, very beguiling talk, and of course a lavish feast that she lays out before them. That is before she casts her magic on them to turn them into pigs. Similarly to the sirens, she lures them in with a sweet melody and then goes in for the kill, metaphorically. And that is present in this portrait. We see Circe portrayed as this very classical, very beautiful figure with her wand in her hand. But in the background, in the darkness just to our right, her left, you can see a depiction of these horrifying dogs snarling, one of which is looking directly at you, the viewer. And her face in this portrait in particular is very neutral. Is she inviting you? Is she threatening you? It might even be a bit of both, but that combined with the ferocious dog snarling at you in the background paints a picture that you may not be welcome. And so I love this portrait for that kind of subtle nonverbal communication. And of course, while we're talking about Circe, I had to give a shout out to the GOAT, Alan Lee. I don't know if he's most famous for this, but in my mind, Alan Lee is primarily famous for his artwork depicting famous scenes and characters in The Lord of the Rings and the greater Middle-earth legendarium. For example, he did some artwork for the Silmarillion and for characters and events in there. And so when I was making this video and found out that he had a depiction of Circe herding the pigs that were the men of Odysseus into their pen, I had to use it in the video because Alan Lee is the GOAT. And her portrayal in this artistic piece is almost very similar to how Alan Lee portrays many elves in his artwork. And in the background, you can see the wild animals that lay docile outside her house. This was the first warning sign to Odysseus's men that they probably should have run away. But this is a really great piece, and I had to give a shout out to Alan Lee because he's the GOAT. But before we go, we do have one last one of Circe, and that is, of course, the painting of Circe offering the cup to Odysseus. This is another one that tells an entire story in one frame, and I have huge respect to people who can do that. Here we see seated, obviously, the figure of Circe. She is offering a cup to Odysseus. This is a cup that is meant to kind of like charm him, mellow him out before she, waves that wand above her head and turns him into a pig. And if you look at her feet just to the right there, you see a pig laying beside her. This is very likely one of Odysseus's men. And in the mirror reflected behind her, we see Odysseus very cautiously approaching, his hand possibly gripping the hilt of his sword. I just think this is a great depiction of the lure of Circe, the trap of Circe, and Odysseus's foreknowledge and hesitation to this whole scene. And then we have this depiction of Odysseus and the Sirens by Waterhouse. I believe that's John William Waterhouse, and I believe he was also a frequent person who appeared in the video that I did on the Odyssey. This, of course, depicts Odysseus's men rowing for their lives while Odysseus is lashed to the mast so that he can hear the sirens call without jumping overboard or doing something equally stupid. And the sirens in this specific piece are depicted as eagles or birds of some kind with the heads of women. And this is much more accurate in my mind to what the Odyssey was trying to get across with the sirens. I don't know if they're specifically described as bird-human hybrids, but they are definitely some kind of chimeric creature. There are, of course, other artistic depictions of Odysseus and the sirens, but for those ones, I would have had to pull out the good old-fashioned demonetized logo PNG so many more times. I already had to use it a lot in the Odyssey video because I don't know if YouTube distinguishes between artistic nudity and just regular nudity. And most of the historical artistic depictions you can find of the sirens, they're basically just nude women. And so I thought I would at least give myself a little bit of a break when it came to having to censor every painting I used in the video. And so I went with the one that in my mind was a little bit more accurate to the story, where they're these weird bird women who lure sailors to their death with their song and not with anything else. And now we come to another very interesting piece of art for me, and that is a depiction of the slaughter of the cattle of Helios by Odysseus and his men. Well, by Odysseus's men. Odysseus strictly prohibited this. But this is the event that caused every single one of Odysseus's remaining men to be slaughtered at sea, Odysseus being the sole survivor, because they killed and ate the sacred cattle of the god Helios, who was the sun god before Apollo. And I think this specific piece of art, I think this is a fresco somewhere. Like, this isn't a painting on canvas. I think this is on a wall somewhere. But this painting kind of captures the horror of what's about to happen. And there was even some cosmic terror in this section of the Odyssey. I talk about it in my video. But there's this great moment in the story of the Odyssey where they have killed and eaten the cattle of Helios, and Odysseus sees what they've done and starts yelling at them, saying that this whole voyage is now doomed, that they are cursed. And at that exact moment, the meat that they are roasting on the fire lifts up and begins to moo, begins to cry out to the heavens, and the hides of the cows that they had skinned begin to crawl upon the ground. But this is the moment just before that, and I think it is a moment of equal terror, at least in the way that this artist depicts it. And it does this so well. It conveys the terror and the kind of the doomed nature of their voyage by doing one simple trick, and that is by breaking the fourth wall. Because if you look into this painting, there are two characters that are looking directly at you, directly at the viewer. The first that you may notice is the cow on the right, a sacred cattle belonging to the sun god. And it looks into our eyes in terror, knowing what is about to happen to it. Now, I'm not going to use this video to get across any kind of vegan or vegetarian message. I myself am a burger enjoyer, but these are sacred cattle and I ain't touching that. And so there's terror in the eyes of the cow that is looking at you, but there is also a sort of malice or evil in the bottom left-hand portion of this image, because the last figure to break the fourth wall is one of the men in the ship who looks directly at you, the viewer, and puts his finger to his lips, silencing us. They know what they are doing is evil and will probably bring doom upon them, but they don't care. And so this man looks directly at us and silences us, making us powerless to stop what is about to happen. And I get so much dread just from staring into the eyes of the cow and staring into the eyes of the man in the bottom left. It is such a well done image. All right, moving on. And to leave off, I'm just going to end on this image of Odysseus and Penelope finally reunited after 20 years. This is the story of a decade-spanning struggle. Odysseus with his perils and near-death experiences out abroad, and Penelope with her political perils at home. Yet husband and wife are both incredibly cunning, and were able to manipulate, to stall, to swindle in order to find their way back to each other. Now, this is a much more contemporary piece compared to some of the others I have shown. I believe this was made in the 20th century, if I had to guess. But in a story that is all about a couple separated by time and distance, I wanted to close this video on the hopeful image of them finally being reunited. It's a very sweet and tender image, if you ignore the demonetization logo PNG on screen right now. But with that, these are some of the pieces that I used for my coverage of the Odyssey that I just loved so much, and maybe a little bit of an explanation as to why I loved them. Because I do love art, and I love these ancient depictions of these historic scenes. And of course, the Odyssey has been the inspiration for many a painting, many an artistic rendition, even in the modern day. If I had a nickel for every, TikTok cartoonist I came across in research for this video, just absolutely thirsting over the suitor Antinous for some reason. Y'all need help. Y'all need therapy. Y'all need Jesus. I promise you cannot fix him. But that's gonna do it for this video. And again, I do want to plug my big video covering the story and the events and the history of the tradition of the Odyssey. It is probably one of my best videos. It is the most thoroughly researched. It is one of my best narrations, and I put a lot of time and effort into it, so it would mean the world to me if you would check it out. And of course, a huge thank you goes out, as always, to the patrons, Sean, Happy the Knife, and the top tier patrons, RD, Snowy, and Bottomless Potamus. Thank you so much for supporting me this far. Thank you for supporting my bigger projects like the Odyssey video, and I hope that you continue to enjoy my videos going forward as I do deep dives like this into movies, into literature, into whatever I'm feeling at the time. For example, I can already feel myself about to do a deep dive into Tolkien lore and Middle Earth history. I can already feel that coming on. I don't know when, but y'all may be getting some Middle Earth content in the future. And I may have at least one more Iron Lung video in me before I'm done with that subject too. And I may even have a couple more videos about the Odyssey coming forward, or at the very least, I'm going to be doing some short form content, maybe taken from my Greater Odyssey video, because I do think that that video is that good, and I want as many people to see it as possible. But thank you everyone for watching this video and kind of indulging me as a casual art fan. I am definitely not, in the thick of it, but I took some courses on the history of art, the artistic movements throughout the centuries, and I absolutely love art, even if it's not something that I talk about too often on the channel. But I hope that you enjoyed this little deep dive into the artwork that I used for the Odyssey video, and I will see you next time for whatever I'm gonna talk about. I hope that you're excited for that, because I know that I am. And cut.